So this session we have titled Relationship Goals, and so you're probably all wondering what type of relationship goals, and I'm afraid that I have to let you down. It's not that kind of relationship goal. It's actually a much more exciting kind, data relationships. That's what we're talking about. So much more interesting than The Bachelor. So what are the relationship goals? What are we going to learn in this session? We're going to learn how you can fetch, using script, any of the data that is stored in your applications, how you can execute workflows algorithmically, how you can calculate things like totals or counts or averages from all of your data, and then get that information in a variable in Deluge. And then also how to add, update, or erase information. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the data access tasks. So when you go to create a workflow, when you're writing some script inside Zoho Creator, they're grouped by these sections. And the second section is called data access, where it has these things for adding records, fetching records, aggregating records. There's a whole bunch of ththings listed there. I'm going to run through and cover as many of these as possible. We're really going to be focusing a lot on how you fetch records with Deluge, because that opens up a whole new world of scripting abilities. All right, so all of these things which I'm going to teach you how to do in script have parallels to like what somebody might do while they're using the application just as a person. And so it's kind of helpful to just think about like the parallel between a particular Deluge task and then what that is like if it's just a person using your application. So adding records, that's like if someone's just filling out a form. They're adding records to the application, pretty straightforward. Fetching records, you could think of that like someone going into a report, searching for a record or a set of records, and then finding whatever information is listed in those. Updating records is just editing records. I don't think we really need to go through all of those. But then there's also this Deluge task called for each record. This is how you create loops, if you're familiar with the concept of looping in other programming languages. And so the way that that works in Deluge is that you have to loop through a set of records or a set of items in a list. Basically, you have to loop through some kind of object, some kind of information that is already in your application. You can't just say loop 10 times and then stop. It has to be based off of some information that's in the application. And so what is a loop? Basically, it's saying, go through a set of records and take a particular set of actions each time you go through one of those records, or each time we go through an item on a list. We'll cover that more later. But for now, let's talk about fetching records with Deluge. All right, this is the fetch records syntax. So, for some of you it may seem easy, for some of you it may seem difficult. It really just depends on your background with programming, I guess, and how familiar you are with Deluge or other languages. But I'm going to go through, I'm going to break this down in as much detail as possible and make sure everybody is super comfortable with how to write a fetch by the end of the day. All right. So the first thing when you're writing a fetch statement, so remember this is just grabbing some information from some part of your application, so we can then use it to do something else. Use it in a calculation, use it to send an email, whatever it is we're trying to do. The first step is we define a variable. And so that variable is what we call a collection variable, because it could be a collection of information. So, maybe we're fetching and we only get one record, or maybe we're fetching and we get a bunch of people's records. So that's why it's called a collection, because it could be one thing, it could be a list of things. It could also just be nothing. Maybe you write a fetch and your program tries to fetch some information from your application, but nothing actually matches what you're searching for. And in that case, it'll just return a null value. Because in programming, we can't really just have like nothing be there. So we created this concept of a value that is called null, which equates to the same thing. All right, so we have a collection variable, and you want to name that whatever you're looking for when you're writing your fetch, which I'll cover more in a bit. Then we have the form name. So you're just putting which form you want to be fetching information from. So for instance, if I have this application over here, which is for managing events, where we have a list of events, we have a list of attendees. When we do the fetch, we're really just like searching through a report, looking for some information. And in order to start our fetch, we have to say, are we fetching information about attendees in the attendees report, or are we fetching information about events from the events report? So that's all we're doing there. We're just finding the link name of whichever form we want to be searching through. All right, and then the last step is the criteria. So this is just saying what kind of information are you looking for. So for instance, if I switch back over here, we have this report. It lists all of our attendees. I can go and I can search for attendees that match a particular scenario. So maybe I want to find an attendee whose name is Sally, and I can do that search, and only her record shows up, right? So that parameter of my search, where I'm saying find anyone whose name matches Sally, that's like writing the criteria part of the fetch. And so I'll explain a little bit more about how that works as we continue here. I already mentioned this, but it's always important to keep in mind this collection. It could be one record, could be multiple records that you're fetching, and depending on what kind of result you get, it's going to change how you work with that information when you're writing your scripts. All right, so how do you write criteria? So we have this thing up here. Anytime you drag on the fetch records block onto your script builder, you'll see this syntax kind of pre-populates, and it's supposed to give you a clue of what you're supposed to do. But you kind of have to be some genius programmer to understand what any of this stuff is saying, because it's just a bunch of words that don't really mean anything until you actually learn what we're talking about here. What is an operator? What is an expression? What is a field? Which kind of field is it? Where is the field? So these are the things that we need to figure out. But it's really not that complicated. So when you're writing criteria, you're really just doing a comparison of two pieces of information, right? Does the name match Sally? Is the amount over 100? Is the amount less than 20, right? These are all just comparisons. And so to do a comparison, you're going to use an operator. So if you're comparing numbers, usually it's a less than, greater than type situation. So there's different operators for these different situations. But in most cases, what you really need to think about is the equal to or the not equal to. Is their name equal to Sally, or is it not equal to Sally? So far, so good, right? Not too hard. Okay, so you can also work with date information. And if you're working with the dates, you want to fetch all the records which are created in the last week. You want to fetch all the records that are 100 years old. Whatever it is you're trying to do, you can use the same kinds of operators for dates. And then in that case, what the operators are comparing is just the chronology. So are the records after a particular date, or are they at the same time as a particular date? All right. So we've been comparing this idea of fetching records, searching through the report for Sally's record. So let's see how we would actually write the script version of fetching Sally's record. All right. So I'm going to switch over to our creator application here. And I'm writing a script here that will be executed anytime somebody fills out the name field on our attendee form. So this example here, it's kind of arbitrary. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I'm just triggering the script this way so we can kind of see how this works with an easy example before we move into something that's a little bit more relevant. Okay, so the first thing that you would do if you want to write a fetch is you would go into your Deluge builder, and you would see that there is the data access functions listed on the left. So you could drag on the fetch records task. And now in Creator 5, what's kind of fancy here is we have this thing which comes up on the left where it actually helps you fill this out. So if you don't want to just write the script from scratch, it kind of tells you all the different parts that you need to have. You can choose which form you want to fetch from, and it makes it a little bit easier. So what we're going to do is we'll call our collection variable Sally info, because that's what we're actually looking for here, all the information from Sally's record. And then I can choose which form, so we want to look in the attendees form, and then I can choose criteria. And so I could just start handwriting some code right here, but what is really useful is being able to know the names of all of the fields on our forms. Because if you don't have those field names memorized exactly, then just if I start writing in here, I might spell it a little bit differently. I might forget whether it's uppercase, lowercase, etc. So what we could do is click on this little button that says Advanced Edit. So I'm going to try that. And then what happens is this little pop-up appears over here where you can specify the criteria of what you're searching for. So this is like the moment where we say we want to find Sally's record in particular. And so you'll see over on the left, there's actually this column which lists, I'll zoom in a little bit more, it lists all of the fields on our form. And what's really cool is that in Zoho Creator 5, we have some new fields that have been added. For instance, there's the address field, there's the name field. We never used to have these things. But what's nice about this in the scripting side is that somebody fills out that big long address field, which we can show in the other tab, which I have over here. This address field, there's all these different parts of the address, right? The first line, the second line, the city, the state, the postal code, the country. So what happens if I want to access just one part of this particular field? We realize that people are going to need to do that, so we've actually broken it down. So you can pull the entire address, you can get just the country, just the the first line, the postal code, whichever part of it you want to get. And similar for the name, you could grab the entire name, or we could look at just the first name, for instance. So I'm going to choose the name.firstname. We'll put that in there for writing our criteria. And then we need an operator. So if we want to search for the name that matches Sally, which we have to put in quotes because it's a string or text, what kind of operator would we want here to find a name that matches Sally? Equals, exactly. All right, so I'll add in the double equals sign. And then there's also functions listed on the right. So if we wanted to manipulate this information before doing something, we could try that too. So for instance, maybe I want to make it so that both sides are uppercase before I do this comparison to make sure that no matter what casing someone typed into my app, it matches up. I could do something like that. But for now, we'll just match any record where the name is Sally, and then we can choose some other information down here. But for now, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to insert this. And then what we see here is our line of script gets added on. So I hit insert, and it just automatically formats each part of the script, drops it into the builder. Okay, so we have our collection variable, which is going to hold all this information. We say which form we're going to look in. We have our criteria. So now let's actually just kind of test this out to see how it's working. So I'm going to drop an alert into here, and then I'm going to alert whatever value we put into this collection variable. I'm going to pop it up in a text box. So when you just write the keyword alert, if you're executing your script while somebody is filling out a form, it'll have a pop-up. And I could put in a specific message into that pop-up. I could say don't click this or something, right? Or you just got a virus. I could try and scare someone. But I could also just use this kind of test things out or debug things. And so what I'm going to do is just print out whatever is fetched into this variable here so we can see how this works a little bit. All right, so I've saved my script, and I will switch back over to the form. I'm going to refresh it so it'll actually work. And so now, do I need to type Sally's name into this box in order to pop up whatever is in that value? No, I don't. Because if you look at my script, actually what's happening here is every single time somebody fills out the name field, we're fetching Sally's record because we've put that into the code. So I could put in anything, actually. I could put in Dylan, for instance, and what will happen is Sally's information will pop up. We've hard-coded this fetch to just Sally's name. So this is kind of like a dumb example. Nobody would ever really want to do this in an application, but it helps you understand the idea, right? You can search for records using any column, any fields that you want. You don't just have to use lookup fields, although in most cases you will use lookup fields. I'll explain why in just a second. So, we've fetched Sally's record, we've alerted it, we've printed it out on the screen, but why aren't we seeing anything that looks like it's related to Sally? We're just seeing this thing which says attendees, ID, it has this crazy long number, so what is that about? Allow me to explain. So when you look at a report in Zoho Creator, you're just looking at information that is human consumable. It's all for you, right? But imagine like you have some massive database, maybe like a DMV database, where you have information about everybody who has a driver's license is stored in some database. So you might have like their names, you might have their date of birth, what type of driver's license they have, etc., etc. All right, everything's good so far. But then what happens when we run into this situation where there's two people who have the same name and they're both born on the same day, right? To us, like, we realize that's just two different people. But how is Zoho Creator going to differentiate between these two records? How is it going to be able to tell one from the other when they seem identical? So for instance, you could have two people who are both named Tejas Gadia, who are both born on the same day, and their name is not that special. Tejas might think his name is special, but it's actually not. And how is the computer going to tell them apart? And this is actually why you've probably encountered this in many places in your life. We have these crazy numbers that are associated with us. We have credit card numbers. We have driver's license numbers. We have passport numbers. When you buy a ticket to something, usually that ticket has some big long number on it. And the reason that we end up having driver's license numbers is because they're completely unique. And so names aren't necessarily unique. Dates of birth aren't necessarily unique. So in order to differentiate between every single record in a database, you need to have one piece of information that's going to be unique and specific to each individual record. Makes sense. All right. So in Zoho Creator, we actually take care of this process for you, because we know that the database needs to have some kind of unique identifier that gets attached to every single record. So there's actually an ID, it's called a record ID, that gets attached every time somebody adds a record into your form. They don't see this happen, you don't see it happen, but Creator is actually generating a unique ID number and associating it to just that one record. So, I will pick up where I left off in just a second with the record ID numbers, but for now, that is the explanation for why we saw that crazy ID number which popped up. When I tried to print out the Sally info, we were actually seeing the record ID that gets attached to Sally, because Creator's saying, like, how do I find this one specific record about Sally? Well, it's going to use the ID number. All right, so what happens if we want to do a fetch, but instead of getting some like garbage ID number, which doesn't really tell us anything about Sally, what happens if we want to look up Sally, but then we want to like zero in on like the phone number and view like just that information about Sally? How could we do that? So the fetch syntax, which I showed you earlier, you use the same exact thing, but then if you want to grab just one piece of information from that record, what you do is you just add on a dot and you say which field you want to look at. So dot name, dot phone number, dot email, whichever field it is that we want to look at, we could just attach onto the end there. So let's test it out real quick and update our script. So now we want to see Sally's phone number. So I'll just do a dot. And then what you see is over here, Creator actually gives you this tiny little pop-up. Right after I type that dot, this pop-up appears. And it lists all of the fields that we could choose from the attendees form. So what I'm going to do is just choose the phone field. And then, because I am a very cautious programmer and I want everyone to be able to understand my script, I will always update the name of my collection variable, because now it's not just collecting all of the information about Sally, it's only going to collect and store her phone number. So I will dutifully update that, and I will hit update right there. And now if I refresh my form, we can test this out. So once more, I can type anything in the box, because we're only fetching Sally's record no matter what gets put in here. We're just using this as our trigger. So when I click outside the box, boom, there we go, Sally's phone number. And so, if you don't believe me, we could go into the attendees form. We can see this is Sally's record. There's the phone number. No trickery is happening here. All right, dynamic fetching. the example I've been showing you, it's a good way to understand how this all works, but no one is ever going to just hard code some fetch. Like, if we just wanted Sally's phone number in a variable for some reason, we could just create a variable called Sally's phone number and type in her phone number. We don't have to go through this rigmarole. But this example is perhaps a little bit closer to reality of how people would be using it. So what happens if we want to fetch dynamically? So based off of whatever someone types into that name field, we'll fetch that particular record. Let's take a look at how we would do that. Okay, so we have our record here. We have the form, and then we say, we want to find all the records where the first name matches Sally. But instead of doing that, what if we want to match whatever someone types into the name field? So the first thing I'm going to do is, because I want this to be based off of something somebody's putting into a field, I'll just write input. And then when I type dot, we get the magic pop-up again. And so now I could actually see all of the fields on this particular form that we're using. So this is kind of a strange example because we're actually fetching a record which is entered into the same form that we're triggering this from, but it's okay. So anytime somebody puts something into the name field, and again, we want to compare the first name, so if I type another dot onto the name, then we can filter this down by the first name. What will happen is it'll find any record in our attendees form where the first name is equal to what somebody just typed into the name field. Yeah, so we're still going to fetch the phone number, but now instead of fetching Sally's phone number every time, what we'll be able to do is fetch whoever's phone number. So I could type in Sally, and when I click out of the box, we get her phone number, so that's fine. But what happens if I type in Teresa? I type in Teresa's phone, or Teresa's name, and now we're getting Teresa's phone number. What happens if I type in Fred? We get null. And the reason for that is because if we look at our attendees report over here, we can see that there's a person named Teresa, but there's actually no person named Fred in our application. So it's trying to fetch somebody whose name matches Fred, it's not finding anything, and it's returning null instead. For instance, what if there was a Teresa Fox and a Teresa Morales? So one thing before we get to that is fetching with system fields. So I just showed you, we're fetching Sally every time. Now we're fetching whatever I type into the name field. So another thing that's useful to know about is that there's also system fields that you can use in your fetches. So besides just the name field, which I dragged on, or the address field, which I dragged on, Creator is recording a bunch of information about every single record, and this is all happening in the background, so you don't really have to think about it. So for instance, the added time is a field which goes on every single Creator record, every single Creator form, automatically, and that's just saving the time that that record was first added to your database. Or modified time. That's also a system field, and it's recording what was the last time that this record got updated. And similar, the ID field. If you want to access the ID of a record, you just type ID. So that's useful to know moving forward. All right, well, let's answer this gentleman's question. How do you fetch multiple records? What happens if we get multiple results? So when you start fetching where you're getting multiple results, there's more things that you have to think about. And consequently, there's more parts which go onto our basic syntax, which I showed you earlier. So once you fetch and you get multiple responses, you have to think about what order do I want these things in? And then you have to think about, how many of them do I want? If I search for Sally and there's 100 Sallys in my database, do I just want to look at the first Sally that comes up, the first 10 Sallys, these 10 through 25 Sallys, the last Sally? How am I going to figure all this out? And so there's a couple parts which you can add on to the syntax, and so these parts come right after your criteria, but before your semicolon. So let's take a look at these. So the first thing is sorting. If you're getting multiple records, you can choose to sort by a particular field. So for instance, I could find all of the Sallys, and I could say sort them alphabetically by the last name if I wanted to. Or, I could sort them by something completely different. Maybe I'm fetching based off of the name, so I'm finding all of the Sallys, but then I could sort them based off of the dollar value of the Sallys as our customers. Like, how much revenue have they spent? I want to find the most important Sally to my business because I'm obsessed with Sallys, I guess. I don't know. And so basically, you just write sort by. You write the name of whichever field you want to sort by. And then this last part of this is you write ASC, which stands for ascending, or DSC, which stands for descending. So you could sort things alphabetically. You could sort things chronologically if you're working with date fields, or you could sort numerically, so from low to high, from high to low. And then the other thing that you can do is you can grab just a range, just a subset of all of the records which get returned to you. So the way you do that is you write range from, and then a number, and then to, and then another number. What's tricky about the range is that the first item on the list of all the records that you get is going to be a 0. The second item is 1. The third item is 2. Because that's how programming works. Because all the programmers say, hey, we want to keep making tons of money, so we'll make this super weird and difficult so no one else can learn how to do it, and we'll keep getting paid lots of money. Using the sorting and using the range, can anyone tell me what sorting and range you would use to fetch the most recent record in a form? You'd sort by the added time. So if we want to be very precise, we'd have to use the system field as it is named by Zoho Creator, which is added, capital A underscore time, capital T, descending order, right? So if we're sorting by the time that they are added to our database, the most recent record will be the first one on the list if we're sorting in descending order. And then we just say range from 0 to 0 to grab the first record on the list. Okay, if every record has an ID, what criteria could we use? So the part in the square brackets, what criteria could we write that will fetch every single record from a form? So every record has an ID. That ID is immutable. You can't change it. No matter how hard you may try, it'll stay the same. And so that ID is never going to be equal to 0. Instead, it'll always be like 20 numbers long. That ID will also never be null, because every single record by default has an ID. So it would never just not be there. So that's how you'd write criteria to fetch every record. And that may seem like kind of a crazy thing to do, but actually there's a lot of situations when you're going to start your fetch by grabbing every single record. Because you may need to say, hey, show me all of my attendees, and now show me the average of like how many days they attended, or the total of like all the revenue we generated from them, or I don't know, whatever it is that you're tracking in your application. If you wanted to do some kind of aggregate type calculation, you'd probably fetch all of the records first. Also, if you're ever doing something where it's like, I want the first application, or the first record that was added to this application, or the most recent record that was added to this application, or the biggest or the smallest, any of these extremes that you want to find like the most of something in an application, you would start by fetching all of the records so you could compare them all, and then just grab the first one from the list, or the last one from the list. All right, so I'll get back to that idea in a little bit, but first, let's take a look at fetching records using lookup fields. When you're working with a lookup field, what you're actually working with is the record ID. So let me explain using a real example here. All right, so this is our attendees form. We have a lookup in the attendees form to choose from one of the events that the attendee has attended. And so this is just looking up all the records in our events form, so you can see our events are for some reason all weird food things that have 2 P's. I don't know why I did that, but it's okay. So this is a lookup field. We're looking up a record that's in another table in our Creator application. And so you would think, if I wrote a line of script that prints out whatever is selected here, if I choose popular pancakes, and in the alert box, we should see popular pancakes, right? So I actually went and I went through the trouble of doing that earlier, so I'll just show you my script real quick. So here it is. It's very simple. So all I'm doing is an alert, and then I'm alerting whatever is input into our events attended field. So it'll display it for us. So if I choose popular pancakes, we get this alert, but what we're seeing once again is just the record ID, right? And this time it's not like that example with Sally where I was writing a fetch for Sally's record. All I did was say print out whatever is chosen here. So why am I seeing an ID number when what I chose was actually the name of the record, right? The name of the event. Shouldn't I be seeing popular pancakes there? And actually the reason for this is because when you have a lookup to a table in Creator, on the back end, it's always referencing a record ID number because it has to be referencing a record ID number. Otherwise, how would we tell the difference between Tejas Gadia and Tejas Gadia if they both have the same name and the same birthday, right? It has to be referencing some kind of unique part of each record. So when you're working with the lookup fields, it's important to remember that when you're writing a script with that lookup field, what you see in the lookup is not what you'll get when you take that lookup field and put it into your script, put it into a variable. So the data type is always going to be an integer, and it's always going to be the ID of whichever record you're looking up. Doesn't matter if I chose to look up based off of the name of the event, the date of the event, or whatever, it's always just going to end up being this ID number. Okay, so most of the time, when people are writing fetches in the real world of using Zoho Creator, they're not just doing something where it's like you hard code the name Sally, or it's like whatever I type into a field is what we're going to fetch, although sometimes you may do that. Most of the time what's going to happen is you're going to fetch some bit of information from a lookup field, because usually when you're fetching a related piece of information. So if I choose the event, for instance, and I wanted to, let's say I had another field here that said like the price of the event, and I just wanted to display that for the person as they're filling out the field, I could fetch that information from our events table and then display it, but I would do that by using this lookup field as my trigger. So most of the time when you're writing a fetch, what will go on the left is actually the ID, that hidden system field. And then what you're going to say is find all of the records that have an ID which matches whichever record I choose on my lookup field. So this is a super, super important concept to learn when it comes to writing fetch scripts. When I went over here, I chose the name of a event, for instance, popular pancakes, and it's popping up the ID numbers of each one of these events, because it's saying anytime I choose the name of an event, it's not going to reference that name, because there could be more than one event called popular pancakes. It's going to reference that ID number. So in the scripting side, whenever we're doing a script based off of a lookup, we're really talking about ID numbers. And this part is always a little bit tricky because it's like the one thing in Creator where like what you put into the field is not exactly what you're going to get when you're scripting with that field. Let's follow another example here. Let's actually switch to a different example application. So here I have an application that's like a order management application where there's orders, and we can have also a table of items. So our items are just going to be these different t-shirts. Each one is a different color and has a different price. And then our orders are just going to be different combinations of these t-shirts. So in here, I have this main order form, but I also have a subform which is referencing all those items which we're keeping in another table. So for instance, I have this lookup right here where I can look up a t-shirt. So I have the blue t-shirt, and then I can put in a quantity of how many I want. I'll just say 1. And then what you see is when I fill out the quantity, it actually calculates the price here. So I change this to 3. It updates over there. But we also have a grand total. So if I add on another row where I have maybe the green t-shirt, and then I want 2 of those, then we see that we have a total dollar amount calculated for each row, and then we also have a grand total where we're adding up the totals from all of the separate rows. Okay, so what we need to do then is fetch the price of an item using the item name lookup. What will our criteria be? So instead of asking you guys that, which is kind of unfair because you don't know the names of any of the variables here, what I'll do is I'll open up this script. So this is what I did to script this subform. There's a lot of stuff to look at here, and it may look kind of complicated, but for now, let's just zero in on one specific part of this. So you can see I was a good programmer. I left some comments to explain what each part is doing so I can remember when I go back. And so this part right here, these two lines, are how we're going to calculate the row total. So the first line here is a fetch, right? How do we know that it's a fetch? Well, it has like a form name. You can see our criteria in the square brackets there. So, and you can tell exactly what we're fetching, both because I gave this a pretty good name, which explains what I'm doing here, but also because you can see that I added on that dot at the end. So you remember from earlier, we wanted to fetch not just the Sally record with that crazy ID number, we wanted to fetch her phone number, so we added on .phone. So what I did here is I said, take a look in the items table and find the item that has an ID which matches the item that is chosen in this particular row. And the one thing that's a little bit tricky here is, earlier I said you type input for when somebody is entering something into a field. But because we're using a subform, it's actually a little bit different in this case, and we use row. So if I type something into like grand total, for instance, because that's on our main form, it would just be like input.grandtotal if I was going to work with that. But instead, it's going to be row.item. So basically I'm saying find whichever record somebody's choosing on this lookup. So that's our fetch. That's the first line of calculating the total for each row. But then what we actually have to do is we have to fill out that field at the end. So when we have over here, we have like, first you choose the item, then you put in the quantity, then it calculates a total. We have to actually fill that in using a script too. So what I've also done is I've written the second line which says, hey, for this particular row, after they've filled out the item, take the total, and you're going to set the total equal to this equation here. And that equation will be the item price. So we're fetching the item price from another table with the information about our t-shirts, putting that into a variable. Take that item price and multiply it by the row quantity. So whatever somebody types into the quantity field, multiply that by the price of the item that they chose, and now we have our total. All right, so this is just a slide which is showing you the script. So in case you kind of want to remember like how I did this, because you work with subforms or something, that's kind of an example, which you can maybe sort of reverse engineer if you go back and look at these slides later. Other thing I want to point out, and then I'll get to your question, is I also had this conditional which contains all of my script. So up at the top, it says if the item in this row is not null and the quantity in this row is not null, then execute this script. And so what that conditional is doing is preventing us from executing the calculation too early. Because otherwise, what could happen is somebody would, maybe they would fill out, they would choose an item, and then it would say, all right, I'm going to try and multiply the price of this item by the quantity, and then if we didn't have that conditional there, it would just try multiplying a number by just a null value, because there would be nothing in that field, and we would get a crazy error. And so that's what the conditional is preventing from happening. All right, looping. Let's take a look at looping. So what looping allows you to do is execute actions, execute some kind of deluse script for each record that you fetch, or for each row on your subform, or for each item in a list. So if somebody has like a field where people are allowed to pick multiple items on that field, you could actually do a for each loop and run through each one of those items and do a particular action. And this is the basis of creating scripts which are a little bit more advanced, doing things that are kind of like algorithms, where you're running through a set of records, and then based off of some kind of criteria on those records, you can choose whether to do one action or not do an action or whatever it is you're trying to do. All right, how does looping work? This is the basic syntax. So you say, for each item, record, whatever you want to call it, this is a moment, again, like the collection variable, where you can just name it whatever you want. So for each row in our subform, we can take some actions. And then the in part is just where you specify what you want to loop through. So that needs to either be a form in Zoho Creator, a subform if you want to go through all the rows in that subform, or a list, so like a multi-select field, for instance. And then you just put some curly braces, and basically any script that you write inside those curly braces will be executed for each one of the record, subform, rows, or list items that matches your criteria. So how do you add on criteria? If you want to have criteria, you could just add it on the same way you do in a fetch. So you could have some square brackets at the end. You could say, for each person in the attendees form whose name is equal to Sally, go through and update their name to something else so we don't have to keep hearing about Sally. Okay, so how can we fetch, or how can we total the price in each row? So what I showed you before was like, all right, I'm fetching the price of my green t-shirt from the items area. I'm inputting a quantity, and then when I click outside that box, it gives me a total for that row. And then, I can add on my blue t-shirt, and I can say I want 2 of those, and it gives me a total for that row. But how did I actually calculate the grand total across multiple rows? The way that I did that is I used a for each loop, so let's actually just take a look at that code right now. All right, so we showed you this part already. You don't have to worry about that. The way that I calculated the grand total is this little bit of code right here. So the first thing you'll notice is that I set the grand total to 0. Let's actually come back to that. Let's focus on just the for each part of this for a second. So I said for each item in my item subform, this is what will happen. What I put in these curly braces is what I'm going to do. So for each row, basically, I could have said for each row, and this would still work. But then what I'd have to do is update this thing to row. For each row in the item subform, we'll take these actions. So what we'll do is we'll take the grand total, and we're going to give it some new value. And so that new value is going to be equal to whatever the grand total was before, plus the total of the particular row. So as you'll remember, all of the script which we're looking at right here is triggered whenever somebody types into the quantity box. And so in order to make this actually work properly, I also had to trigger this script in multiple places. So if I close this out here, I will close it. You can see that I have multiple script actions here. And so one of them is when somebody chooses the item, and it's actually the same exact code. So basically, I'm doing all of these calculations anytime somebody chooses an item or anytime somebody updates the quantity. Because what could happen is, what if each t-shirt has a different cost? If I switch this from a blue t-shirt to a white t-shirt, we might have to update things because white t-shirts cost more for some reason. So what we did is, in order to make this work properly, we have to reset our grand total to 0 because otherwise what it's going to do is it's going to take the grand total and it's going to say, add on whatever this row's total is. And if we didn't reset to 0 every single time, then what would end up happening is it would say, say somebody landed here and they had put in some information here and it had calculated a grand total. And then they said, actually, I'm going to change my mind, and instead of 2, I want 5. If we didn't reset to 0 each time, what would happen is it would take our original grand total and then total up the rows again and add that on, and so we would end up with this inaccurate count. So I included that script in the slide, but what I really want to point out here, what's the essential part of this, is the ability to access each subform row or each record that we're looping for. In order to access it in this part, where we have the actions, we can just give it a name. So for each row in our subform, we want to take the row.total, right? We can access the fields in the rows. Or for instance, we're looping through a bunch of records in a form, the same principle applies. For each attendee in the attendees form, we could do something with the attendee.name or attendee.phone number. All right, so there's just a few more things I want to show you guys. What are some other things you can do using the data access tasks? You can update records. So once you fetch records, you're fetching the information, you're putting it into a collection variable. You can then go update any field you want from the records you fetched. So I could say, take Sally info and then do .name .first name and then set it equal to something else if I want to change Sally's name in the database. It's pretty straightforward, but the part that you have to remember is if you want to update records with script, you always start by fetching records. You have to get that collection variable before you can update it. That's just how updating records works in Deluge. You can also aggregate records. So for instance, you can fetch, and then instead of saying, .phone to grab the phone number of whichever record or records we're fetching, we could also do some kind of calculation right there. So we could say, find everyone named Sally, and then give me, .count, and it'll tell me, how many people named Sally exist in this database. Or I could say, maybe .average, and then I could put in one of the fields that's associated with Sally. So maybe, I don't know, all these Sallys have different heights for some reason. This is a terrible example. And we're recording this in our database. We could find the average height of people named Sally by putting in .average and then whatever the name of our height field is. Okay, so I had this other quiz here to find the average cost of our items, but we're a little bit short on time, so we can't really do that. So you could just look up the average price in our particular application by using this script. And basically what I could do is I could go over here and say when our order form loads, here we go, I've got it already set up here. I want to fetch all of the items, so ID is not equal to null, that'll just grab every single item. And then I want to take the average of the price of those items. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just alerting, I'm printing this out, but I've added on a little bit of text. So take the average price into the average price variable, and then we're going to print that out, and we're going to round it down to 2 decimal places. So that's what I did right here. So now I'll uncomment out that script so it'll actually load. And if I refresh our order form, you see it prints out the average price of all the items in the database. You can also add and delete records. The principle is very simple. Basically, if you want to add a record to a form, you can just say insert into the name of the form, and then you just say what values you want to put in each field on that form. So one thing that's important to note is you don't need to have, when you do the add records, people are always like, oh, I'm supposed to put semicolons everywhere. Creator's always giving me this warning message which says I don't have enough semicolons. I'll start adding them in right here. You don't have to do that. That's just not how the syntax is set up for this. And then also, if you want to do some kind of functions to manipulate the information before you add it into a form, you should probably do it in a line prior to the line where you insert. So you would put it up here instead of in the insert task. Last thing you can do, you can delete records. So basically, you understand how this works. You just write some criteria which will match a certain number of records, and then you say which form they're in, and then you just write delete from before all that, and it'll delete those records for you.